Hey legends, and welcome back to the ARPG Corner. So, what a crazy couple of weeks it's been. I'm glad to finally be back, and I'm glad that in spite of everything, we at least have one little bit of good news. Namely, that the Wolcen developers have decided to actually fix Solarfall. Solarfall is one of the channeling skills in the game, and the reason that this is a fantastic thing for us is that it actually allows us to viably play our Armageddon Mage build without crashing the game. So let's get stuck into it. Now, while we're loading, be sure to smash subscribe to stay up to date with all future build guides and ARPG news. For those guys who are just here for the build, look down in the comments. I've got a link to the Wolcen Universe calculator. All of the stats are there, all of the skills are there, and you can recreate this build one-to-one using that. Now, one of the things that came up in this build over the, I suppose the weeks that we've been doing it is, people were mentioning that it doesn't scale so well in the endgame. Like, I've gotten to this expedition level and it can't do it, or I'm struggling against these mobs or these enemies. And one of the things that I want to show you guys here today with the ultimate refined version is us doing a level 187 expedition run. So that is some of the highest level content in the game. On a build that isn't entirely refined. It's certainly a lot better than it was the last time you saw it, so I'm sure you guys are keen to see what's changed. Clearly the items have. A lot of red going on. I didn't realize there was an achievement for getting that, by the way, but that was really nice. Good touch from the Wolcen devs. Now, without waffling on too much, what I want to do is actually show you guys the build in action so you'll understand how it plays, the whole dynamic, and then after we're done we can recap and talk about the skills, the itemization, and all of that sort of slightly less fun stuff at the end. So, expeditions, all the way right to 187. Alright, Caves of the Sleeper, let's do it.
Do that.
So, to those of you not familiar with this build, essentially the way it functions is you walk up to a mob, as we have, and you press, looking at the the skill layout down here, 3, 3, 2, 1, right click. So what that does is hit them with an extremely effective combo of skills, right? 2 vortexes, sorry, 2 anomalies, 1 Plague Burst, and 1 Tear of Athaliel, followed by Solarfall, the skill which no longer crashes our game, fortunately. No longer causes that memory leak, which after about a level or 2 causes you to crash out to the desktop, which is amazing. It means you can actually play this build, which is great news because it's a really, really fun build to play. And as you can see, we're just grouping mobs. This is one of the hardest level difficulties in the entire game, and we're just completely just waltzing through it. Don't care. I'm not a worry in the world. The problem with this build really runs into is under 2 circumstances. The first is, hey, thanks game. The first is wealth omens, right? We cannot kill wealth omens worth a crap, so you'll be chasing them all over the map and then they'll eventually run away and you'll just be swearing, and you know, that's the price you pay for this build. The other one is the level boss. So the level boss is very frustrating in the sense that I think currently they're still sort of broken in their general health pools compared to the standard mobs. They just take way too much to whittle down, and the only way to whittle them down is by using effectively I wouldn't call them hacks, but really exploiting ailments a lot and exploiting Immortal Offering quite a lot, which is what we're doing for these mobs as well. So one thing you'll notice with this build is that the larger the mobs are, the more DPS we're doing, and actually the easier it is for us. So the higher we go in these expedition levels, and the bigger the clusters and concentrations of these mobs, the quicker we can take them out. You can see once we get down to the single, see, it's almost not worth taking this guy on at this point. So what I would suggest doing with this build is just simply kiting him down, let him follow you all the way through the level until you run into another trash mob, and then you can use them to detonate him. We'll explain how this all works after the fact, because I don't want to stop the action too long to kind of run you guys through skills. But predominantly what we're doing is using Mark of Impurity to use these enemies as detonators, essentially. You kind of put Mark on the weakest of the trash mobs, and as soon as it goes off, it spreads it to all the nearby enemies, and then they all detonate one another for various quantities of health, spreading all kinds of different ailments such as curse stacks and whatever else. And then of course leaving the green plague smoke behind. So one thing I've noticed that's really, it's somewhat hampered my enjoyment of the endgame is that the game is still very bugged with certain aspects of the netcode and the way that certain skills play out. So I'll occasionally be stuck in an animation where my guy is, instead of like launching a turret, auto turret down, he'll just hold it in his hands and shoot around instead of allowing me to move around and, you know, survive hits. The other ones are, and this will become much more obvious when we get to the actual level boss, is that what happens doesn't necessarily correlate with what you're seeing on the screen. So you may be getting damaged, you may be experiencing attacks that you think you're dodging, but according to the game behind the scenes, you're actually not. And I can't help but feel that this is something to do with the netcode that they haven't quite ironed out yet. So charge moves like that are a great example. So let's say I tried to dodge out of the way, yet the damage may have still applied. That kind of stuff happens all the time. And here you can see one of the fun aspects of the build is just the insane crowd control and the insane dots. There's numbers all over the screen, especially with the bigger mob sizes. And I'll explain all of this after we actually finish the run. But yeah, it's worrying at points. So the numbers used to actually crash the game at a given point. It used to create a memory leak and it couldn't handle it, but fortunately now we can. I always consider it a bit of a litmus test personally. It's like, how much of an FPS drop can you cause with your build? You know, the bigger the FPS drop, generally the better your build is going in an action RPG. And in this case I feel pretty good. When everybody is detonating, I'm getting to like the mid two figures, which on my video card is quite impressive given that it's a 1080 Ti. I have gotten it down to the low two figures a few times when things got really hectic. But I think for now we'll just try and keep it here for you guys. If we don't drop beneath 60 and the video is nice and clean, I'll be happy with that. So the general principle behind the build is obviously crowd control and auto attacks. We're grouping them using Anomaly. We're using Plague Burst to detonate corpses for exponential damage, and we're using Tear of Athaliel as a DOT. Tear of Athaliel is that sort of rain firestorm thing you can see coming down there. But I think the majority of our damage probably gets done by Anomaly and Solarfall. Solarfall is really good because it does sacred damage, which triggers the whole EOS tree. EOS tree will auto-kill enemies once they're beneath 15% of their total HP pool, which kind of helps us. It doesn't seem like very much, but I think once you play this game long enough and the HP pools are large enough, you're happy for any kind of percentage off you can get. So we've almost summoned the end boss. One of the sort of, I suppose one of the more gambly aspects of this build is that you're trying to take out all the mobs on the way to the boss without necessarily killing all the mobs immediately before the boss, because you sort of need to kite the boss back to those mobs in order to get yourself the damage multipliers to take it out in a, you know, sensible frame of time. So again, I don't think the meta has been very tweaked for the endgame right now, and this is very obvious by the fact that legendaries don't function in the endgame at all, with the exception of perhaps the Trials belt and the freeze to crit chance armor. Now, the Trials belt is something I would be using as part of this build if I had one. Now, unfortunately, in about 200 hours of playing this game, I've yet to have one drop. It's just RNG, you know, the way things go. Fortunately, this way, it gives me a build that's a lot more universally applicable to you guys as well, because I would imagine only a fraction of you actually have the Trial belt. So this way, we're doing the Mark of Impurity manually, which is still fine. As you can see, like, at no point has this build even come close to struggling. Like, we're just cruising through this content. It's just like it's nothing. My biggest disadvantage right now, especially compared to my older builds, ones that were using more broken mechanics in the game, is that we lack a mobility skill. So I'm stuck just kind of running around manually like this. We don't have Warpath or Ether Jump or whatever else. But I think it's a small price to pay for something that's so consistent and survivable at, you know, the very end levels and the very end difficulties of the game. I mean, I'm just running around through this like it's, I don't know, level 1 or something. It just doesn't matter. So, on the whole, I'm very happy with this build, and I hope you guys that were naysayers about its viability in the endgame are satisfied by this. Obviously, my items help me a lot, so I've spent the last day just upgrading all of my yellows into reds. I would suggest that you guys, when you get the resources to do that, do the same. I really hate these bosses, so you're going to see, I guess, how frustrating this whole thing can get. Their health pools are tremendous. demons of souls are just kind of frustrating to fight, even when you just run into a regular one, much less a boss. So what I'm trying to do is get a mark of impurity on one of the plebs, get the plebs to pull in, and I triggered a roll there. I should have rolled through that, but it didn't count for whatever reason. So you can't actually do the kind of platforming, you know, timing puzzle combat that the game wants you to do against these bosses, because for whatever reason you get damage even when you're not supposed to be getting damage. So notice our rate of damage on him is slowed down a little bit. I may try and kite him back to some mobs unless we can. We're not doing too bad actually. We might be able to just take him out organically. That is assuming I stop getting DOT'd. Well, that's not going to be a good sign. I may die again, folks. Nope. Cool. That's good. I'm going to explain why that is, by the way. That's because my resist is super high, and you need super high resists in order to survive in the end game. Come on. Yeah, I'm not too thrilled with my damage. Let's see. I'll demo the whole kiting him out to the mobs thing, and show you guys how you generally want to do this with most bosses on the way up here. So yeah, get your anomaly on the boss. Get your anomaly on the boss, try and put mark of impurity on the plebs, and then yeah, they all just detonate each other. And honestly, if you get a mob that's large enough and you pull the boss back to it, or they spawn next to one of those like altars that spawns enemies, you can just virtually one-shot them. I've taken out endgame bosses in about 5 seconds, under the right circumstances, right?
I don't have enough space.
So this whole next level business, I'm guessing it takes us all the way up to 189 or thereabouts, but we're not going to bother with that for now. So yeah, that was basically a level 187 full endgame expedition, barely breaking a sweat other than that time I got killed for absolutely no reason because of the netcode. I'm going to maintain the blame on that. So let me try and explain to you guys what's going on. We'll start with the itemization. So I've been very lucky. I've been collecting a lot of items to specifically tailor this build to the end game. I'm not just willy-nilly like I was in the other videos, which is why we're calling this the Ultimate Edition. It's still not perfect. I'd say it's maybe 80 to 90% there. There's still room to improve, but on the whole, I mean, you can see why I'm fairly happy with it, right? So on the shoulder pads, we have some of the main stats. We got flat damage boost, rage and willpower cost decrease, which is super important for a build which spams this many spells. Resource generation is completely useless. It's just something that rolled on this thing that I hate. Toughness, super important because you want a high health pool. I find about 80,000 minimum is a good idea. Now I've had to sacrifice some of my health pool in order to go for more resist, but we'll get into that soon. Crit chance score, again, no brainer. Crit chance, if you can maintain it between like 50 and 60, you're generally in business. So from there, we've got the helmet, 3% damage per 100 unconsumed rage points. That's something that dropped during one of my untainted runs that I was happy about, because we're always spamming skills. You can see that there's usually a little bit of rage. Yeah, there we go. There's usually a bit of rage being generated, so you usually got a couple of hundred to play with, and that's an extra multiplier on my DPS, which is always very nice. Flat damage, ailment chance score, which is a no-brainer for a build like this, because we're doing primarily occult damage. And cooldown decrease for all skills, which is a must-have in this slot, and also ideally in this slot. So I've got 3 cooldown reductions, simply just so I can spam more Solar Fall, I can spam more Anomaly, and spam more Tear of Athaliel without necessarily taking the cooldown on the skills themselves. So other shoulder pad, flat occult damage. This is probably the highest flat damage boost I can get on an item because I do so much pure occult damage, and I'll explain to you guys why. Rage and willpower cost decrease, again, no brainer. More toughness for HP pool, critical chance score, and plus to all res, which is super important. Now in the chest piece, you'll notice the helmet and the chest piece are both heavies, and that's for a very particular reason. We're using a skill in the Siege Breaker passive tree that is multiplying, gain all resistance score equal to all resistances score on equipped heavy chest piece, and likewise on the helmet. So basically multiplies whatever we have here and there by 2. So we're getting many thousands of all resists simply from that alone. So you can see 8,500. That's a almost 73% reduction to all physical damage, and again, the only reason I was able to survive so comfortably in an expedition that's such a high level. So moving on. The gloves, flat damage, resource generation, again, completely useless stat, just one that happened to roll in an otherwise fantastic gauntlet. We've got ferocity, which is crit chance and damage, no-brainer. Crit chance, which is crit chance, which is, again, a no-brainer. Flat health boost, which is very, very good. And the other one is much the same principle, except we actually pick up some more rage and willpower cost decrease. Ideally, I would have that on both gauntlets, as well as both shoulder pieces. That way we can just spam to our heart's content. I mean, look at how much I can just spam without the willpower running out. So it's almost like we get about three sequences out of it before I have to start getting the turret out and regenerating the willpower. So it works out pretty well. So with the rings, flat damage to spells is the most important. Occult damage is the second most important. Spellcasting speed score is obviously, helpful. In terms of the gems, I've got transfer time decrease between willpower and rage on both rings, as well as the amulet. The reason for that is the downtime, right? So you can see this little black bar as I'm casting spells. That little black bar doesn't last for very long, and that's because of transfer time decrease, right? Otherwise, if you're playing stock, it's going to take ages for it to transfer to rage, it'll take ages to transfer back to willpower, so you'll be stuck with a lot of downtime where you can't cast. So the endgame viability of this build is very much contingent upon the quality of your gear. You need cooldown reduction, and you need transfer time decrease between willpower and rage as well. So the other ring, more flat damage, a boost to all res, which is absolutely amazing. Critical damage and elemental ailment chance, both very good things because we do elemental ailments. Not many, but some. And moving on to the belts, flat damage once again, most important thing. I've got spell crit chance score in there as a gem. I mean, it's not critical. With the gems, it's more about what you need at a given point in time. It doesn't have to be what I'm using. It's really based around what you're doing. The flat occult damage boost, willpower regen, occult element chance is almost perfect for this. The only thing that's out of place here is the 13% attack damage. Literally everything else is spell focused, but that is the one attack skill on this entire thing. Otherwise, it'd almost be a god roll. So, moving on from there, we've got the pants. The pants, I think, are the closest thing to a god roll that I have. So we've got flat damage, transfer time decrease between willpower and rage, cooldown decrease for all skills. So those two things on one piece alone make it a virtual god roll for me. And then the rest is two skills multiplying the amount of all res that you get, which again gives us those massive resistances that we're dealing with. The health regeneration rate I can take or leave. I mean, it's nice to have, but that's probably the one stat that I could live without on the entire piece. In terms of the main weapon, this is literally just a placeholder. This does very little that actually helps me whatsoever. All it does is give me access to Mark of Impurity. It gives me flat critical damage, which applies to everything, and duration to stasis inflicted on enemies, which is really good because I rely on stasis and ether damage in order to create some of my damage multipliers, which we'll talk about very soon. So, that being said, that's probably the most disposable piece on the entire kit, ironically. And moving on from there, we've got the catalyst. So with the catalyst, I've loaded it up with willpower regen. Willpower regen is kind of a no-brainer, and you can see it, The quicker the regen, the more you can spam, it's kind of a resource self-actuating thing. Flat damage to spells is by far the most important here. You want to get at least 2. Spell critical chance score, spell casting speed score, critical damage and duration to weakness inflicted, all extremely relevant to my build, and only 53% minus the transfer time decrease between willpower and rage. This is what I would consider to be a very strong roll. It's not necessarily a god roll, but it's extremely viable, as you can see in the endgame. Now, the boots are kind of take it or leave it. I just rolled these before. I've got another couple in the works. So all these have is flat occult damage, material res, resource generation, completely useless. The wisdom boost isn't fantastic. The movement speed is nice, and the boost to all res is nice. So I've got like basically 3 stats out of the 6 that I don't care for. So these are definitely going to go in time. And yeah, that about runs us through the crux of the gear. It should probably explain everything. If you guys have any more questions, don't hesitate to let me know in the comments. Now, attributes, very simple. Vast majority went into toughness. Ferocity, you go until you essentially have in the mid-50s when it comes to your spell crits. Anywhere from 50 to 60 should do the job, and then the rest you just dump into toughness, because survivability is pretty much everything in the endgame. So this is almost I think almost identical to what we've run in the past. I'll very quickly explain to you guys what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, just in case you've forgotten or any little bits have changed without me realizing. We make our way up the soldier tree, picking up all the crit stuff, make our way across, and then into the assassin tree to keep collecting all of the crit stuff. There's really no way around this. Crit builds still dominate everything. We work our way into Kabbalist. Kabbalist is the one that makes the build work. We go up here to grab the ailment stacks. Now, you may want to grab the +2 ailment stacks with the 30% decrease to damage that doesn't deal dots. Reason I haven't done this is the one piece I haven't told you about, my amulet. You can see +2 ailment stacks inflicted, so I get this for free without the damage hit. That's extremely amazing, and you can only get that stat to drop, I believe, in Untainted runs. So that's my goal from here on out, is to get a few more of these. You can actually collect them on your rings as well. So if I'm able to actually apply 6 ailments per tick, that will be, I can't even imagine the power of this build when that ends up happening. So up to you whether you take this. From there on out, we work our way up here, grab some flat spell damage into Immortal Offering. Immortal Offering is a must. It's what makes this build work. It's the little the passive buffs that you saw in the bottom left as I was murdering all the hordes. Without that, you lose so much of your DPS. Working our way across, we grab Power of the First Men, 50% chance to multiply the number of ailment stacks inflicted by 2. You can make this 100% if you've got the points for it. I thought it not worthwhile. I'm inflicting plenty as it is, but if I had the free points, I would probably maximize that, especially if I had the +2 ailment stacks on my rings. I could basically apply 12 ailment stacks every single time there's a tick, so you would constantly be maxed out. You would constantly be debuffing and annihilating everybody. It's just crazy. Keep going up here and make sure to grab Grievous Afflictions. Can now apply 1 additional ailment. This is an ailment based build. You want to maximize ailments, you must get this. Work your way up into Siege Breaker, and this is what gives us that multiplicative bonus to our all res score on our chest piece and helmet. Now work your way across to Plaguebringer. Plaguebringer is really amazing because it allows you to have 6 different damage types working with Immortal Offering. I'm gonna try, if I remember, to explain to you guys how I get 6 different damage types, how we get all of those different multiplications and all of those different ailment stacks. There's a little bit of craft to it that you have to master, but it shouldn't be too hard once you get to grips with how the game works. So working our way across, we go up into Eos, we go all the way through the spell and sacred damage, and we grab Dawn's Pious Striker. Dealing sacred damage instantly kills enemies below 15% of their max health, and then that applies it to champions and bosses as well. That's a no-brainer. So instead of having to take them out all the way down to 100%, you only have to take them out to 85%. They auto-die. No-brainer. Now working our way across, we go into Abyssal Shaper. Abyssal Shaper is very good for us because it gives us 15%, a total of 30% occult damage, and since we're basically exclusively doing occult damage with our main skills, it's a 30% damage boost. And eventually, it eventuates in occult damage increased by 5% for every curse stack an enemy has, bearing in mind that occult stacks already weaken them to damage as is. Now, once I get the extra point, I'm going to grab the +2% here because I'm constantly applying these stacks and these elements to the enemies. This is really, really useful, especially if you're an element build, as we will be. Now, we work our way back here, right? Go into the Scholar Tree, Rage and Willpower cost decrease. We grab 150 max willpower and rage, and make sure to grab 15 radius for picking up health globes. This basically lets you suck up globes from anywhere on the map. It's absolutely amazing. So every time you drop a Plaguebringer orb, so Plaguebringer orbs essentially give you a 30% damage boost 10% of the time you kill an enemy, which can give you some insane multiplications, as well as toxic ailments that you apply to the enemies. You collect those globes immediately. You don't have to run into the fray and risk your life. We work our way down into the ailment stuff. So I've grabbed occult ailment chance and just flat ailment chance. There's a really good boost. We're sitting at about 30% ailment chance, give or take. Work our way through the Scholar Tree and make our way down here to Warlock, right? Go up. We grab 100% spells crit chance score while willpower is above 75%. This isn't always active, but while it is, it's nice to have. Work our way down here and grab the max willpower and rage pool boost, which is really important. So these two combine for the 350 bonus, which is very, very handy. Now here's one of the build makers, right? We have to go down into Time Weaver. This has to be done. Go down, collect the max element stacks, collect this dire juncture. You only take 40% damage from an enemy's attack when they hit you. The rest is dealt 1 second after the hit. This will allow you to survive being otherwise one-shotted by super insane enemies in the end game, especially while your resists are low. You have to take this for survival. It's a complete no-brainer. Another 5 maximum ailment stacks, and then eventually another one of our build makers, which is which time cannot heal. When you hit enemies afflicted with stasis, they take 100% of the hit damage again after a 1.5 second delay. Now that damage is not crit, so even though you're doing crits, that ongoing damage is not a crit, but it's still significant enough to add a lot to your DPS, and you can grab another 20% on top of that if you so wish. So, working our way back up here, right? So we're back in the Cabalist tree. We work our way around and we grab the global life leech and life leech from spell damage. You can grab that here, or you can grab it down here in Warlock. It's really up to whatever jives best with you. I prefer grabbing it here since we're already on our way. And one of the reasons that we basically burn all of these points working our way down is 1, to get Bestial Frenzy, extra damage for each nearby enemy, but primarily persistence hunting, 25% damage to enemies with impaired movement, so enemies that are slowed in stasis, stunned, or frozen. So we can freeze them, sure, we can slow them, but the easiest way is to put them in stasis because we're in a cult-based build, right? Anomaly applies, as we can see, ether damage naturally as its dominant damage type, which means you're going to be putting people in stasis by default, which means impaired persistence hunting is going to apply essentially no matter what under all circumstances, so it's a flat 25% damage boost to all enemies. Very, very handy, very, very useful. So, with that all said, I hope the skills are very well and thoroughly explained. If you want to see them in detail, I will have the link to the Wolcen Universe build guide down below in the comments. Make sure to check that out. Now in terms of these, you can actually see these on the build guide too, but I'll try and run you through them quickly to explain the philosophy behind this build. So Tear of Atheliel converts base frost to fire damage. Very simple reason that we do that is we want to be doing fire stacks. We want to be applying fire stacks, so Immortal Offering will give us a 5 times bonus based on those fire stacks, as well as our damage types from other things that we're applying. So otherwise we'd just be freezing them, and freezing them is cool because it gives us the impaired mobility 25% damage boost, but since we're already stasising them, it would kind of be redundant to freeze them as well. Like, we're already getting plenty of crowd control from Anomaly and everything else that we're doing, so it's a bit redundant. We convert it to fire, increase our DPS by quite a bit. Move on from there, increased chance to inflict ailments. We are an ailment based build largely, so that's a good thing. Alter the skills so that it deals damage over time. That's a complete no-brainer. That's just kind of how you want to use this thing, because you group them all together. It's going to deal DOT, it's going to do a lot more damage over time in aggregate than it would as a flat damage thing. Moving on from there, increase crit damage, and increases damage and increases willpower cost. Now, everything here is pretty much optional other than these two. I mean, you may opt to use it as a frost thing. It may work better for you that way. I mean, that's optional as well, but I would say the DOT is probably the only inoptional one for this build, so everything else you can tailor to your own heart's content. Now, Plague Burst we use in order to detonate enemies and cause massive multiplicative DOT damage over time. Increase area of effect, increase ailment damage, increase ailment chance. Allows a skill to be cast at the location of the cursor, that's a must-have. Leave a poisonous cloud when an enemy or friendly summon dies, dealing DOT, that's another must-have. These two will make it work. Increase crit chance, increase explosion damage for each ailment stack a monster has, and because we're applying a lot of ailment stacks, anywhere up to 30, they're big explosion damages. And increase crit damage. So Anomaly, one of the main ones that makes the build work. I'm experimenting with increase the area of the damaging vortex. I'm finding it's pulling more people in, I think, from further out, unless it's a placebo effect I'm experiencing. It at least looks cooler on the ground being larger like that anyway. Kind of combines with the Plague Burst. And then Tear of Atheliel is kind of punsy, but it doesn't matter because Tear of Atheliel, like, everybody's being dragged right into the center of the vortex. Once you cast the tear there, they're not going to get away from it, so you don't need to increase its radius. Now, Anomaly. Moving on, we've got increased ailment damage, increased vortex duration, that's a must-have. The skill's vortex pulls in enemies multiple times. I would strongly suggest using this. Increased crit chance, optional. Skill allows the casting of 2 vortexes. That is a must-have. That's just going to exponentially multiply your damage. As you can see, I've cast 2 right there. My cooldown is so quick. Bam, another 2 immediately. And then the Tear, and then Solar Fall, and then Plague. I mean, they're just getting melted. They're just getting utterly annihilated by this build. And finally, we have increased crit damage. Again, optional, but I like these ones. So the next big one for us is Solar Fall. It's one of our big damage dealers, and now that it doesn't crash the game, we can comfortably use it. Damage dealt by the AoE increases over time. That's great, because they're stuck in the AoE, they can't escape. That's a great thing. Increases the tick rate. That's another great thing. I haven't actually measured this myself. It may not work. You guys let me know. But in principle, increased tick rate is a very good thing. We've got Plasmic Eruption. Creates a nova when dealing critical damage. Effect has a cooldown. Increases your DPS overall. Area of effect leaves a trail that damages enemies, which is amazing because, I mean, that area is always there. They're always standing on it. So you can see why there's so many dots going on at any given time. It's just insane. Sin Illuminated increases crit damage by 25%. And we've got Area of Effect becomes static when cast, can be recast, change its location. That's probably the only must-have one, I think. All the rest seem optional, yes. So Sunrise is the only must-have because it allows you to cast it without channeling. You can still run around. The whole operative ethos behind this build is that you can just run around while the skills auto-attack and just melt everything for you. Great, so that's Solar Fall. Next big one is the Mark of Impurity. So I'm doing a couple of main things with it. The first is I'm applying curse stacks. The curse stacks are fantastic because of the aforementioned reason that we've got Occult Affliction, 5% increase for every curse stack an enemy has. So that's a 50% boost to anybody that has the mark. Not to mention that the curse stacks themselves give an actual weakness to damage, so that's all multiplicative. We move on from there and we've got Fate of the Unholy. Enemies killed while under the effect explode and deal damage based on the target's max health in an area around them. If you get this like domino detonator effect just right in a mob, you will one-shot everything. Like this is what I've used to one-shot bosses before. If you get it, it's absolutely magical watching like how many tens of millions of HP just get melted away in a split second. Increases crit damage on marked enemies. That's probably the only optional one. You can grab whatever. Marks have longer duration, more vulnerable to damage. It doesn't really matter. And then the other one that's super important is Guilt by Association. Mark of Impurity spreads to surrounding enemies on the death of the target. So the only thing I would change about this build is if I had the Trial Belt, which automatically casts Mark of Impurity, I could possibly ditch these two and just hold the staff and then just kind of not have the Mark of Impurity there. It would auto cast on enemies and I could left click in order to get all my willpower back. I wouldn't need to be a hybrid build anymore because that's really the only reason I need it. So I've got the auto turret as a willpower generator and a rage spender, and I've got Mark of Impurity for the debuff, clearly, but that's the only reason that I have this as a hybrid build. Now, speaking of which, there's actually another reason I have the auto turret, and that is to apply yet another stack of Immortal Offering through lightning damage this time, right? And the way that we do that is converts base physical damage to lightning damage. Fantastic. Turret gains an additional... you know what? All of this doesn't really matter. All of this other stuff is incidental. All that matters is that the turrets are applying lightning damage and they're spending your rage and reconverting it back into willpower so you can spam more DPS. That's ultimately all that this skill is here for, and that's all that we use it for. Now, to break down the sort of damage types that we do, it's kind of hard to contiguously do this, but you can see it on my catalyst. We're primarily doing Sacred and Shadow. Here I'm adding Shadow and Sacred as well, and one of the reasons that I'm balancing my damage types out like this is so I actually get all the stacks that I want. So you have to go into combat and you have to try things out on mobs and see what stacks come out of it, right? So if you're not triggering like Occult, if you're not triggering Curse, then you've got to do a little bit more of that Shadow damage. If you're not triggering enough Weakness, then you've got to do a bit more of that Sacred damage. You've got to get it until you're doing like an almost equivalent amount of all three occult damage types, and they're going to constitute the majority of your damage. As you can see, just Ether, Sacred, Shadow, got a bit of Lightning, Frost, Fire. As you can see, a little bit of Elemental in there too, but primarily Occult, which is why the Occult multipliers are so important to us. So everything that you get on your weapons, in your on your gems, everything that's adding flat damage to spells, you want it to ideally be As you can see, my rings aren't adding the correct types of damage, so they're the ones adding the fire and the lightning and the fire and the frost. So in a better circumstance, yeah, there we go, Ether and Sacred. That is an almost perfect amulet right there. It's so good, other than the useless damage towards hacks. So we definitely want something that would be adding occult damage rather than this elemental damage, which is something I may work on over time. That'll give me even more effective DPS. But this is something you have to do yourself based on your gear. I can't give you a template. You have to build that damage cocktail so that you're getting all 6 stacks of Immortal Offering. The more stacks of Immortal Offering, the more DPS, the more death, the more multiplications. So be thrifty, learn the meta of the game, and sort it out for yourself. So, if you guys enjoyed that, and I hope you enjoyed that, it's my penultimate build. I love playing it. As you can see, it's super endgame viable. If we were to play like a level 150, we would have melted it like no tomorrow. So that was only a little bit tricky because it was an endgame thing. I mean, I love it. I hope you love it. If you love it, give me a thumbs up. Make sure to subscribe, stay up to date with future build content and ARPG news. If you disliked it, make sure to smash the dislike twice and show me who's boss. And until next time, have fun. Stay safe.